We're delighted to have Niamh here. Niamh is the Director of Studies, Niamh is the Professor of Political Science and Public Policy in University College Dublin. She has a lengthy resume, but I'm just going to confine myself to say that she has worked for the Economic and Social Research Institute. She has been associated and lectured in the Somerville College in Oxford, and she is very central in UCD's Athena Swan in a successful application under the Athena Swan initiative, which I presume most of you who are concerned with gender inequality in higher education will be very familiar of that importance and significance of the achievement of it. So, Niamh, thank you very much for agreeing to share the panel. So that will be the panel hosted and coordinated by Niamh. But as I've said, that Barbara, due to the clash that was unavoidable, has agreed to come here and to kick off, as it were, the gathering. So Barbara, in your own time, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me, or do I? Yeah, because you won't see me if I have to go behind the. So I think it's better probably I say here. So good afternoon, everybody, and I'm sorry for being the difficult problem child of today's thing. But I am leaving my colleague Jonathan Healy, who will replace me when I'm gone, and who is the economic attaché at the Commission representation. So is very well skilled and versed for today's discussion. So I'd like to thank, of course, FEPS and TASC for inviting me here today. I've been asked to focus on the economic governance framework and the Commission's proposals to reform it. And I mean, this publication says time for a reboot, and the European Commission fully agrees that it's time for a reboot, which is why we have proposed to reform it ourselves. So first, maybe for those who aren't, I mean, I know I'm in a room full of experts, but for those who maybe just need a refresher, that the EU economic governance framework allows the EU to monitor and coordinate economic and fiscal policies of the member states. It consists of two main elements, the Stability and Growth Pact, which seeks to limit the risk that unsustainable build-up of public debt in one member state could have a negative effect on others. And the second part of it is the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which was introduced in the wake of the global financial crisis to identify, prevent and address the emergence of macroeconomic issues that could have a negative impact on member states' economic stability. However, the Stability and Growth Pact has become rather complex, with many indicators and rules, and that is indeed a point pointed out in the FEPS study. It has tended towards a one-size-fits-all system that has neither prevented a build-up of public debt nor safeguarded important public investment in many member states. And while the macroeconomic imbalance procedure successfully raised awareness of risks to economic stability, it has not always resulted in member states making the policy choices needed to address those risks. So basically, the fiscal rules were designed in a very different economic and geopolitical environment than prevails today. So it's only right and proper that they should be adapted as the world around us changes and as new challenges emerge. So the Commission started its review of this framework already back in February 2020. We weren't to know then that in March 2020, COVID was about to wreak havoc and our review had to be put on hold so that we could focus on the response to the COVID pandemic. At that time, the General Escape Clause was activated, which allowed member states to deviate from the rules to cope with the huge economic and social challenges presented by COVID and later by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. This being able to have this general escape clause, of course, has helped us to be able to keep firms open and functioning and maintained people in jobs, but it has also obviously led to very high levels of public debt, because we have had to basically subsidise the economy with, in the light of these sort of unprecedented challenges that we have faced over the past years. So we launched the review. We relaunched this review back in October 2021, trying to take stock also of the lessons we learned during the pandemic. Since then, a broad range of stakeholders have been consulted, including through an online public survey open to all citizens and civil society representatives. Discussions, of course, are also being held with the member states. Last November, the Commission set out its vision for the most comprehensive reform of the EU fiscal rules since the economic and financial crisis, in a communication on orientations for a reform of the EU economic governance framework. Our proposed reforms aim to give member states more flexibility, and we try to also and would enhance the macroeconomic stabilisation role of fiscal policies in two main ways. First, the reformed framework would use an expenditure rule as the sole operational indicator of medium-term fiscal planning, the so-called net primary expenditure indicator. Some of you will know that, some of you won't. This indicator was chosen as it's under the control of governments or indeed ministers of finance. Expenditure is now a clearer concept, and it's in the hands of national governments to manage. So if you like, it's much more, to use that awful word, respectful of subsidiarity in terms of how much power will lie in the member states' hands. Secondly, the reform system would incorporate robust escape clauses so that we're able to address exceptional situations where the endorsed fiscal adjustment path cannot be realistically followed. In the event of major shocks to the euro area or the EU as a whole, which we have seen over the past years, a general escape clause would be maintained to deal with a severe economic downturn. In addition, an exceptional circumstances clause would allow a member state to deviate from its medium-term fiscal path in case of exceptional circumstances outside the control of the government, which could have a major impact on public finances. So the important thing here is that the proposed reform will give member states more leeway in setting their medium-term fiscal adjustment paths, but more flexibility will go hand in hand with a greater focus on enforcement, in particular with respect to breaches of the treaty, defined deficit and debt thresholds, which you mentioned also in your study. The proposed reform would simplify and clarify the triggers for enforcement procedures by focusing on member states' deviations from the agreed medium-term paths. So what we will have, hopefully, is a more balanced framework by ensuring that debt sustainability, which is our holy grail, does not come at the expense of investments and growth. That the new framework will be more credible, with more gradual and realistic plans to bring down debt. So the 1/20th rule would no longer be the focus of debt reduction, which is, I think, something you would welcome, all of which would be underpinned by stronger enforcement. And also another feature is to be more transparent with simpler rules to replace what is now a much too complex set of rules. So there will be greater ownership at national level in designing debt reduction paths, and this together with rules that are easier to understand will make, we hope, the framework more democratic and accountable, and indeed easier for people to understand. It's also important to note that the Commission will not be telling member states how to spend their money. That's up to them to decide, but they must do so within this framework, knowing what the risks are if they make unwise investments or if they exceed the various restrictions that we have enshrined in the treaty. So over the past number of months since we published these proposals, we've been discussing them with the member states. Many of you I know read Politico in the morning, and you've seen some things about that this morning. But based on these discussions, we hope to be able to table legislative proposals in April of this year, following the discussion which is taking place today and tomorrow in the Economic and Financial Affairs Council, and later this month the European Council. So we are hoping to be able to go ahead with those, and they will land on the desk of the incoming or the next presidency of the Union, which is the Spanish presidency. Meanwhile, we had to produce fiscal guidance for 2024 because obviously these new rules will take a couple of years possibly before we are actually able to use them. So while this reform is winding its way through the EU decision-making process, we are trying to manage the short term by proposing, last week we published fiscal policy guidance for 2024. In this guidance, it was made clear that while the new legal framework is not yet in place, the current legal framework continues to apply. At the same time, to allow for an effective bridge to the future fiscal rules that we hope will be agreed, and to take account of current challenges, some elements of the Commission's proposed reform that are consistent with current legislation could already be incorporated into the fiscal surveillance cycle. Member States were invited to set out fiscal targets in their stability and convergence programmes that comply with fiscal adjustment criteria set out in our reform orientations. They were also invited to discuss how their reform and investment plans are expected to contribute to fiscal sustainability and sustainable and inclusive growth. A brief word about links to other policies. The reform of the economic governance framework cannot be seen in a vacuum. It also needs to be considered in the light of other developments that have been put in place, that have been undertaken to support the fiscal position of member states. For example, the support for member states when COVID-19 struck and economic activity came to a halt. I already mentioned that. We activated the General Escape Clause, which will continue to form part of the new fiscal rules, so that will still be available. However, we did much more than just use the fiscal rules or loosen the fiscal rules. We also proposed the Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is an €800 billion stimulus plan to ensure investments and reforms continue to be undertaken across Europe in the aftermath of COVID. Another example is Repower EU, which is a response to the global energy market disruption, as I mentioned, caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We came up with Repower EU to try to encourage member states to become more self-sufficient, to not have to rely on imports of energy, fossil fuels from Russia. And there is 270 billion available for member states for targeted investments towards energy, to diversify energy supplies and accelerate the rollout of renewables. And Ireland is set to receive €1 billion in grants to support its recovery and resilience plan. So, there are other funding mechanisms running in parallel with the fiscal rules. We've the Just Transition Fund to support those most affected by transition to climate neutrality. We've the Innovation Fund to fund and develop innovative technologies. Horizon Europe, you all know that, the big research and development pot of money, almost €100 billion. And of course there's the Social Fund. There are other funds where Ireland obviously receives relatively less than they used to in the past because, of course, Ireland is considered to be quite a rich member state. So, I mean, I just wanted to mention those to know that, you know, there's a whole other area as well as the fiscal rules. So, three main messages, and I'm finished. I mean, in answer to the question posed by the FEPS policy paper, European fiscal rules, time for a reboot, we fully agree, and it's underway. And as I said, we hope to be moving forward very, very quickly once it's discussed by the European Council at the end of the month. My second point is the proposed reform will give member states more leeway in setting their medium-term fiscal adjustment paths, but more flexibility goes hand in hand with a greater focus on enforcement at EU level, in particular with respect to breaches of the treaty-defined deficit and debt thresholds. And finally, as I said, fiscal rules should be viewed side by side with other supports to member states, Next Generation EU and the green transition, the digital transition, all these things where there are special where there's funding earmarked and available to support member state investments in these areas. So, you know, final piece of propaganda, the EU exists to support the development of its member states, and we are at our best when we join forces and work together, and when one member state isn't allowed to go rogue and destroy the happiness and development and well-being of another. So that's my last point. Thank you very much.
Rosa, sorry, Barbara, do
Yeah.
you want to take any questions on the basis of what you've just said? Or shall we move on to the panel discussion?
I think I've taken up enough time, to be honest, so
Yeah,
but my colleague is here now, he's here to replace me, and you can call on him for any questions for the Commission.
Thank you very
Is
much.
that okay? Thank you all. Sorry, apologies.
So, very warm welcome to everyone. After that really great introduction from Barbara Nolan from the Commission, we're nicely set up now to understand the context into which this TASC report is speaking, and the further reflections and problems, perhaps issues that will be raised by our other discussants around the issues involved in designing fiscal rules for a very diverse European space. So I'd first like to introduce the members of the panel and then invite them to present their remarks to you. First of all, we have the two authors of this very nice report. Rob Sweeney is, of course, known to everyone here, I'm sure, as the head of policy at TASC. He works a lot on his main interest being inequality, and he's written a lot of projects on things such as income distribution, housing, care, corporate tax, and many more, all centering on inequality concerns, which is a really big theme for TASC, of course. Rob has a PhD from the University of Leeds, and he works there on the growth of the financial sector in Europe. Rosa Canelli is a researcher in political economy at the University of Sangno in Italy, where she teaches international economics. She also has a PhD in economics, and she was working mostly at the University of Leeds and also at the University of Sangno. And her main research interests are in the fields of macroeconomics, monetary economics, fiscal policy, and then income distribution, economic modelling, financial crisis and financialisation. So between the two of them, they have a wide range of relevant expertise that all of which are touched by EU fiscal rules. I'm next going to introduce at the other end of the table Sebastian Barnes, who is the chair of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council and also deputy chair of the network of EU independent fiscal institutions. This is something I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about today. He's also head of division at the OECD Economics Department. He has an MSc from the LSE in economics, another master's in European political economy from the Collège d'Europe in Bruges, and He studied originally in Oxford, where he is a graduate of PPE. And I too was a tutor in PPE. It was teachers and chaps.
I think a good mark.
And now, Marie Sherlock is, again, well known to many people. She's a senator of the Irish Labour Party. She's from Cork originally. She's been living in Dublin a good while. This is on your bio.
I was going to say, I don't know what it's actually written here, but go on. But always sensitive.
Let me tell you. You're introducing yourself.
You can blame me, I'd put it together.
Okay.
She's a trade unionist. She has degrees from Trinity and UCD and Cambridge. She's the former head of equality at SIP2, and she's currently on a career break from this role. She's been active in fighting for workers' rights, housing, gender equality, and many other issues. And Marie is also a former researcher with the Party of European Socialists at the European Parliament. So she has research practitioner and political interest, again, extremely well qualified to participate in this debate. Very creative. So we're delighted to have everyone here, and I'll just hand straight over to Ross.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Just crack on with it. Okay, so fiscal rules. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that it's one of the, if not the most important aspects of European economic policy making. And as Barbara already alluded to, it bleeds into other areas such as climate change, Green New Deal, and many other aspects. But the issues I'll focus on today, as per the report, I will talk a little bit about public investment in Europe. We'll talk about debt, obviously being one of the central aspects of the fiscal rules and the costs of servicing it. Then I'll hand it over to my colleague Rosa and co-author. She will hopefully demonstrate that if you look at the various metrics as to what predicts or causes public financial stress and financial unsustainability, we will argue in the report that it's much more the cost of servicing debt, the interest payments, is a much better predictor than the level of debt or the size of the deficit. And we argue that we should emphasize debt servicing much more than debt level or deficits in new fiscal rules. And so we discuss a little bit the fiscal rules and then some reform options. So if you look at public investment in Europe, historically, I don't have a little mouse there, but historically it was very high. If I just draw your attention to the top left panel for the moment, we'll see that, say, in Germany and the Netherlands in the 1960s, public investment was around 7-8% of GDP. So European governments spent enormous amounts of money around the 50s and 60s in public investment. And importantly, there was no fiscal rules which prevented them from doing so. And it has since declined. Now, it's probably in the case of Germany and the Netherlands and countries like that, a lot of it was driven by the need to rebuild their economies after World War II. If I draw your attention to the bottom left for the moment, it's largely the same story in Northern Europe. You can see the black line there with Sweden. This line here, the dotted line, that's Ireland. Ireland is a little bit different. It's a much more cyclical trend. So we had fairly high levels of public investment in the 70s when we were doing relatively well, and then in the 1980s when we were having lots of economic problems, it fell, went back up in the 2000s when we were doing good again, apparently doing well. So it's very cyclical in Ireland, public investment. Southern Europe, the top right hand, no real pattern there except for since the crisis, public investment has been depressed. Central and Eastern Europe, bottom right, no real pattern, though less data to comment on. So what might be driving this? One thing to consider is that it's not just that there's fewer options and fewer need for public investment after World War II and the rebuilding of economies. One issue is that the price of investment goods has fallen a lot. So, classic example would be computers. As our societies and economies have become much more productive over time, the cost of buying a computer has fallen enormously. And you can generalize that into investment goods. So the price of machinery, the price of various types of investment goods has fallen relative to the price of goods and services throughout the economy. So actually, a lot of the decline in public investment that we see in Europe is merely that the price of investment goods has fallen. The actual amount of volume of stuff hasn't actually fallen. We discussed that in the report. I don't have a huge amount of time to go into it here. So I'll just draw your attention to the graph on the right-hand side. This is a survey of infrastructural quality among different countries. So the black dots is surveys of corporate executives throughout the world, the World Economic Forum. The bottom series is a series called Logistics Performance Index. It's a survey of professionals working in international trade. I don't know how much you can see of it, but anyway, on the very right, it's the rich countries, unsurprisingly, the Netherlands, Spain, France, Germany, which are perceived by these people who are working within the industry and knowledgeable people to have the best infrastructure. And it's the poorest countries primarily. It's the Bulgarias, the Romanias, and so on, which have perceived to be the lowest infrastructural quality. Ireland also does very poorly for a country as wealthy as it is. It's here, so it's between Estonia and Lithuania, and is perceived to have lower infrastructural quality than Greece, Slovenia, and so on. Importantly, the countries with the lowest infrastructural quality perceived to be are those with the greatest challenges in terms of climate change. Romania, Bulgaria. Ireland also has very high emissions per capita. So it's important then that the fiscal rules facilitates public investment. Not least because they need it, but also if you look at historically, the rich countries spend lots and lots of money on public investment. So it's not really fair that the poorer countries should be prevented to, or discouraged might be the correct word, from doing so under the current arrangements. So moving quickly onwards, these graphs look at the level of debt, the black line, and also interest payments relative to GDP. So the level of debt and the cost of servicing debt, interest payments to GDP. And we argue in the report that actually it's the cost of servicing debt, it's interest payments relative to GDP, which is the most consequential metric when you think about the implications of borrowing for a country. We really should focus on debt servicing or interest payments to GDP. Very briefly, the reason would be, if you think about it, if a country has lots and lots of debt, but it doesn't have to pay much to service that debt, it's not that consequential, the debt. Now, you might say, well, they're going to have to pay this debt back sometime. Well, that's true. But what countries typically do when they have a loan or a bond coming due for payment, they typically issue another bond to repay that bond. And then when they need to repay this new bond that they've issued, they issue another bond in the future. So countries typically roll over debt again and again. And so the issue is, of course, they have to pay interest on that debt. But that's the crucial metric. It's the interest payment on debt, which is the measure of interest payments to GDP, is the measure of how onerous debt is to a country. That's what we argue in the report. And another point I'd like to draw your attention to is that in recent years, graphically illustrated in Germany, particularly, debts and interest payments used to move very closely together. So the level of debt was a pretty good indicator to how onerous the debt was. So interest payments and debt moved together. However, in recent years, there's been a divergence in terms of the level of debt and how onerous that debt is to repay. And similarly, we see it with Italy, Romania, we see it across the developed world. So it's because interest rates are much lower in the last 2 decades, basically. So importantly, conceptually, we believe that it's the burden of servicing debt which is the important metric, and particularly in recent years, the level of debt is less insightful, shall we say, in terms of how onerous it is to borrow. So I'll just hand over to Rosa now.
Thank you, Rob, and good afternoon, everybody. Basically, to confirm this idea, the idea that Rob was explaining before, that is the burden of servicing debt and not the level of debt, not in the increase in the level of debt, which is of relevance for financial stability, we basically carried out an econometric analysis which attempts to look at how changes in public debt, changes in public deficit, and changes in the debt servicing burden affect the probability of a financial crisis. And the aim was to basically identify the variables which best act as leading early warning signal for public finance sustainability stress. I'm not going into the technicality of the study, but basically here we have some results, and the table shows that the increase in the burden of servicing debt increases the probability of crisis more than other variables, so more than the level of debt, more than the level of deficit. And this basically emphasizes the need to focus on debt servicing as a more powerful predictor of financial unsustainability rather than deficit and debt. However, fiscal rules attach great importance to debt, to deficit. Let's briefly see what fiscal rules actually say about that. So we know that fiscal rules were presented for the first time in the founding documents of the European Monetary Union, and we know that the Maastricht Treaty introduced the famous convergence criterion that countries must meet to join the euro. And the Maastricht Treaty also defined 2 important reference values for public debt and public deficit, stating that the overall government debt should not exceed the 60% of GDP, and fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP. As we can see from these graphs, basically at the time, and I would say still now, several countries had debt levels above 60%, and some of these countries basically exceeded the deficit limit. The criteria came under immediate criticism for different reasons, and especially for being too rigid, not grounded on solid theoretical background, not grounded on solid theoretical framework or economic rationale. But despite these considerable criticisms coming from economists and academics from different perspectives, the original European views were reinforced over time. And here we can see the evolution of the European economic governance. And we can see all the majority of the revision that have been made, revision that essentially led to the current framework. And what we can say is that the relatively simple initial structure given by the given by the Maastricht Treaty was reinforced by the Stability and Growth Pact, and then later was subject to many revisions that increased its complexity over time. So basically each revision added more details, each revision added more exception, and the rules became more sophisticated, more complex, and less transparent. One reform that we can mention is the Fiscal Compact. This Fiscal Compact clearly builds on previous revisions and focuses on structural deficit and on a debt reduction rule. What is structural deficit? Structural deficit is the budget deficit that is independent of the business cycle. So it's independent of the fluctuation of the economic system, it's independent of the ups and downs of the economy. As we detail in the report, we can say that there are important methodological issues, important methodological problems related to the structural deficit. And we discuss in the report this part, and we say that essentially its measurement is controversial and is subject to frequent revision ex post. Even the debt reduction rule is controversial. It's controversial because essentially if the debt is higher than 60%, basically countries have to reduce the difference by 1/20th per year on average. So if applied today, if applied now, this would impose a large and unrealistic level of austerity in some countries. But at the moment, the European fiscal rules are suspended. They were suspended through the activation of the general escape clause. And in a sense, this allowed countries to mitigate the negative effect caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the suspension and the COVID-19 crisis, in a sense, renewed the debate on the need to reform the fiscal rules, because there is consensus, I would say, on the fact that simply going back to the same rules, simply going back to the same framework, to the same principle, will not work. So several proposals have been made, and recently the Commission presented its proposal. We heard about that before. What we can say about that? First of all, we can notice that the reference value, so the 60%, the 3% for government debt and government deficit, would be maintained. But country would have the possibility to negotiate, in a sense, their adjustment path. More specifically, the Commission would basically propose a reference fiscal adjustment path in terms of net primary expenditure. Then Member States would submit their plan, and in this plan, Member States would outline, in a sense, the reform and their public investment commitments. Then this plan would be discussed and would be negotiated with the Commission first and later with the Council. And if accepted, Member States would implement the plan over 4 years with some flexibility. But the aim is to ensure that the debt trajectory is sustainable in 10 years. The aim of the Commission is basically to simplify the framework. But what we can say is that its communication, in a sense, represents an attempt to change the approach without changing the fiscal framework. Clearly, there are some improvements. For example, improvements are represented by the abolition of the debt reduction rule. There is the possibility to negotiate the plan, and there is also the use of a net primary expenditure instead of unobservable indicators. But I would say that there are many questions open to debate. There are many shortcomings. For example, the central structure is still there. So the parameters, the limits for debt and the limits for deficit are still there. The Commission does not propose a golden rule which would exclude investment from the European fiscal rules. And more importantly, the adjustment path which is proposed by the Commission will be highly dependent on the debt sustainability analysis, which present a lot of measurement problems. So I would say that there is still a long way to go, so there are a lot of questions to be discussed, and there are many questions still open to debate. I would ask Rob to conclude with some remarks.
Thanks. Just very briefly. So we have a couple of policy recommendations. One is that, in line with what other people have said, really, we should have fiscal standards and we shouldn't focus on hard, fast rules such as 60% debt to GDP, 3% deficit. Now, we're realistic, and we should focus instead on the burden of servicing debt. Now, we're realistic. This isn't the kind of a trajectory of reform in the European Union. So maybe as an alternative, we could revise the debt limits to 100% of GDP. Another proposed reform is that we should have an EU climate investment fund. So similar to the next generation EU, the EU could set up a fund which would, the EU would issue bonds and set up a fund which would help member states meet their various climate obligations. They're in the report. So I won't rehash because we're running a little bit over. So thank you. And I will.
Thank you both very much, Rob and Rosa. And I'm going to call on Sebastian Barnes next.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to see such a big audience gathered to discuss the fiscal rules in the European Union. It's actually a really important subject that gets like no public discussion, which is a pity. It's actually very important. What I want to do is I want to give you a bit of a wider perspective based on my experience on the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council and in the network of the EU independent IFIs. I'll give you a slightly wider perspective, and I want to touch on two issues that are emphasised a lot in the excellent paper, actually by Robert and Rosa, that I would recommend you all read. So firstly, I think we need to approach the subject with a bit of humility. It's really hard to design the fiscal rules, very heterogeneous countries. Fiscal policy is a very delicate balance between short-term cyclical sort of management and long-term sustainability. And in the EU, there's no real agreement about how to do this, how fiscal policy works. We have very different institutional traditions. This is a really, really hard thing to do, and that's why there's such a big literature on it, of which this is another useful plank we see this afternoon. There are two basic conditions that need to be met. One is that the rules need to be well designed. So if you follow them, you need to get to a good outcome. And then the second thing is compliance and enforcement. So you can have the best rules in the world, but if no one follows them, there's no point having them. So you need to meet these two basic conditions, and that's really what the whole game about reform is about. Now, Barbara used some words to describe the European proposals, but they're quite complicated. So I'm going to try and do it with a bit more of a picture, though I appreciate this picture is quite fuzzy. And also I've got unusually good eyesight, so for me it's fine. It's okay for those at the back if you're struggling. Starting on the right-hand side, okay, the basic thing, the Commission is going to do this debt sustainability analysis. It's going to work out, and I'm going to explain that in a second, it's going to say this is the level of spending that you can have over the next 5 years, so sort of path of rising spending. The country is then going to come up with its own proposal for a national fiscal trajectory, and then there's going to be some kind of agreement between them and the Council. As Barbara mentioned, there are a few other things that are interesting about this rules. There's some new enforcement procedures. Whether those are any more successful in the past, we'll have to see. There's going to be less scrutiny for low debt countries. So one of the things at the moment the Commission would go and give a load of scrutiny to like Denmark and the Netherlands that have quite low debt. Now it's going to allow those countries essentially more freedom, so it can focus more on the hard cases, the countries with high or medium debt. There's also a question of the enhanced role for fiscal councils. Some versions of, you hear the Commission talking about this and national ownership, they say it's very important. Barbara didn't mention in her speaking notes. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that. But I wanted to explain this first stage, it's quite hard. This is basically what they're going to do. So this blue line, this dotted line going up, this is the debt to GDP ratio in a kind of baseline, right? So this is a country where it's got a debt level of about 100%. If it just carries on its current policies, and this also reflects aging costs, right, which are the pressures in the years ahead, debt would rise. So what the Commission's going to do, it's going to set its adjustment period between 4 and 7 years, which is the shaded blue line here. And then it's going to look beyond that adjustment period. It's going to say, if you keep those policies in place, what's going to happen to the debt ratio? And it says, well, we're going to require countries to put the debt on what it calls a plausibly continuous downward path. They've kind of given hints that basically means a 70% probability that the debt ratio wouldn't rise during this period. And then what they're going to do is they're going to work backwards, and during the adjustment period, countries are going to have to rebalance their public finances so that this condition is met, right? So this country, if it stays on the current policies, debt's going to rise, so they'd have to do some adjustment in this period. So basically they'd have to grow spending less quickly than growth in the economy to some degree over these years, and then they'd be on this path. So this is basically the logic of what they're doing. Now this is a really complicated calculation, but when you turn it into a level for the debt, it's quite easy to understand. It'll be like you can spend 100 billion this year, you can spend 110 billion next year. One implication of this, I think, is probably for most high and medium debt countries, debt would have to be on a fairly reasonable downward trajectory not to have a very high probability of going above 7, or 70% probability of not rising. So this is basically what they're explaining. So there's the hard bit, which is the maths behind this, and then there's the easy bit, which is this target that hopefully will be easier to enforce and easier to observe and understand. So will the reforms work? Well, short answer, I have no idea. The slightly longer version of that answer is the one that Rosa gave, which is there are a lot of open questions. So the Commission actually hasn't published its reference path, so we don't really know whether it's going to be really strict or not very strict or whatever, and there's probably a lot of arguing going on about that in Brussels. Secondly, it's really unclear whether what will happen in the end is that we'll get something very close to the reference path proposed by the Commission, or whether country will propose something very different and that will be accepted. Barbara seems to emphasise the idea there'd be a lot of flexibility. I'm not so sure. And there's a trade-off, because there's good flexibility. Some countries have very specific circumstances to be taken into account. But there's bad flexibility as well, which is a country doesn't really want to sort out its public finances and so makes like it. So it's very hard to get that. So we don't really know what's going to happen. Then there's this question of, will national institutions be strengthened? You can read what you like into Barbara's silence. And then will compliance and enforcement really improve? The idea is that because countries have signed up to this path in Brussels, that they will then go back and implement it more seriously over the coming years. I don't know whether that's true. So that's an open question. Now, I just want to touch on two issues that have a lot of airtime in the paper. The first is how to deliver higher public investment. So I think there's no doubt that public investment in every country is going to have to be much higher than it has been in previous decades, partly because of climate change, digitalisation, improving public services, housing in the Irish case. And there's a very simple theoretical case to treat investment differently from current spending, right? It's not just money that's gone, it's money that's going to deliver services in the future. But in many ways, public investment is quite similar to current spending. First, it has a cyclical impact. When you put the money into the economy, it's the same as spending current money, basically. And you can have a public investment boom that's unsustainable in the same way that you can have a private investment boom that's unsustainable. And secondly, we have to think about sustainability, and that's the bit I'm going to focus on a bit more. Now, firstly, it's really hard to know what the investments, public investment, actually are. Some of them, by design, are not supposed to yield any budgetary impact. So I think it's a really good idea to build flood protection around Dublin with rising seawaters, but that's not going to increase the size of the tax base at all. It's just going to keep our feet dry. So there's no fiscal return to that. It's a useful thing to do, no public return. And also, as we know from investment projects, a lot of public investment projects are very good. Some of them have pretty bad returns, right? And again, you don't have to go very far to think of examples of that. Secondly, this is a bit of a geeky point, but in principle, a lot of public investments actually depreciation and replacement, which should actually be counted like current spending. It's not an investment. So it's only the net part, which is typically relatively small. And to the extent that we've got a steady state increase in the capital stock, those two things will kind of roughly balance. Thirdly, I'm not really convinced that spending rules have limited investment. In this sense, I think in this causal sense, I think if we hadn't had rules, we probably would have got more public investment. But governments could have made different choices, and they didn't. So I was in Italy the other week, and in Italy, 25 to 30% of government spending is on pensions. They've just spent 5% of GDP on the most badly designed renovation scheme that I've ever seen. Again, they could have made other choices. And actually we know this because this is the picture for Ireland. If you scale it relative to the GNI star, Ireland is actually bringing investment back to pretty record levels and planning to maintain them for many years. And we've done that not by having a golden rule. We've done that essentially by keeping taxes more or less in the same place, if not raising them very subtly, and also through some restraint on the current side. So I think rather than always having this instinct that we should borrow for investment, we should think about the case of paying it through higher taxes or lower current spending. I'm not saying we shouldn't borrow at all, but I do think that sometimes this instinct we should borrow, and actually we should make some choices. As Barbara said, EU funds are relevant here, and actually if you're really worried about low levels of investment, you should just put a rule that says you have to invest more than X% of GDP as a minimum. Right? That's the easiest way of achieving it. Secondly, I want to come to this issue of debt interests and risks. So like the paper, I don't really believe in the 60%. I don't think there's any particular magic to that number, but I also kind of would apply the same logic to 100%. One of the good things, I think, about the reforms from the Commission is this medium-term focus on the debt ratio. I think that's very sensible. And they include pensions, which in almost every country, the unfunded pension liabilities are much bigger, if you were to compare them, than the interest costs, right? So most countries are paying 8 to 10% of GDP on pensions. They're paying like 2% on interest rates. So pensions is actually much more important. Now, the real point here is about risk. So this is a chart from a paper that Ed Casey and I did a couple of years ago. And this basically shows the same shocks applied to a debt path, but at different levels. And you can see that if your debt ratio is down like at 25%, these shocks don't really make any difference. But if you can see you're up by 100 or 200, this actually just scales in a linear way, you're much more sensitive to shocks. The good news for the Irish audience is we are on a path probably to get debt to a low enough level that we won't really need to be too worried about it anymore. But we're not there yet, which is why we need to stay the course. But I think a much better, I'm kind of skeptical of targeting interest rates. Because interest rates can change a lot, right? As we've seen, they've really jumped up in a couple of months. The debt ratio, on the other hand, is much slower moving. And so I think that kind of provides a better anchor for the public finances. The risk is that interest rates change very quickly, and then it's incredibly difficult and costly, and it takes many years to get it back to the right level. So I think this is the right target. I think we should recognise that lower interest rates do make a difference. There's more pace to borrow than there was before. We can take more risks. But I think we do have to be very, very careful about that. We have to recognise that interest rates, and actually what matters more is the interest growth differential is really important. And for Ireland, this is the killer. Because interest rates are probably pegged down by the euro, it's quite stable. Growth in Ireland, right, imagine something goes wrong with the tech sector or whatever, that number could get very nasty very quickly. Finally, there's 2 points on the paper where I think I have a slightly different view. Finally, I just want to touch very briefly on what this means for Ireland. So I think the Commission's proposal are actually pretty similar to what the government is now doing with the 5% nominal spending rule. The Council's welcomed this as a strengthening of Ireland's fiscal framework, and it's very similar. It should be strengthened in our view. It should be in law, and that would require the government to spell out a lot of the details they haven't done so far. My second point implication for Ireland is that given that I don't know whether the EU framework is going to work or not, I think the best thing is to have a really solid domestic framework as our first line of defence. And that's really what we should be relying on, which hasn't always been the case in the past. When we've relied on the EU framework extensively, particularly in the run-up to the housing boom, it ended very badly. We have to recognise that Irish specificities like excess corporation tax are never going to be very well dealt with in the common framework. So we're much better doing this ourselves. And also, it's not just a question of solvency. It's also, we should really be trying to make the best choices we can around climate and pensions. And that really needs a good, fact-based social discussion about what we want and how we're going to do it, and fairness between the generations and things like that. Which the EU framework is a bit like the emergency room in sort of medical, A&E. It's like, it's rough, it's when things go wrong. But we really need a more positive approach to prevention, shall we say. But I'd say Ireland does have a really strong interest in the success of the EU framework, and both growth and stability in the euro. So we obviously need to engage with this process a lot. If you've got a lot of time in your hands this weekend, I would recommend further reading. But otherwise, thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. That was a tantalising little hint. I have a lot of have time on that, Maya. What should I be reading? Irish Fiscal Advice and Council reports, obviously.
Yeah, they're all good. Yeah. The second one.
I'm sorry. See, I've my back to this.
The second ones are for there are a series of publications the IFI network has done. The most recent one is the one from March.
Okay.
This comment on the Commission, and then the debt one is top is pretty good, and the long-term. So actually, I'll sneakily advertise that we have a conference on the 23rd.
30th.
On the 30th on saving for the future, which is basically about corporation tax and pensions. So Eddie can tell you the details afterwards. You're very welcome to that as well.
Oh, that's nice.
Somebody's performing an orderly queue.
Great. Well, there you go. Date for the diary. Thank you very much indeed, Sebastian. Okay, Marie Sherlock now, please. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And if it's okay, I'll stay here because I don't have a presentation, and I'll be quite brief because I'm conscious as well. I think there are so many faces I recognise in the room and people whose jobs it is to I suppose on a daily basis follow I suppose the both macroeconomic I suppose policy in this country, but also at EU level. So I think that potentially be a good Q&A. But I suppose firstly just to thank TASC and FEPS and indeed Robert and Rosa for their very detailed paper and really good contribution. I think it's a very timely contribution to an incredibly important conversation that is currently taking place. I suppose within the European Union, and I agree with Sebastian. We spend very little time in this country talking about the fiscal framework that we want, and of course it's not a sexy topic, but ultimately it boils down to the type of spending and tax policies and investment policies that we want for our country. So I suppose one of the things that really strikes me is that. As being kind of widely accepted and indeed in the paper as well, the Fiscal Compact that was agreed back in 2012, that has failed. That's why the European Union is now back at the drawing board effectively, because it was honoured more in the breach than in the acceptance. And I'm kind of struck looking at some of the faces here. Many of us in the room would only remember 2012 only too well, and indeed the kind of bitter pill that many of us felt we had to swallow in accepting the Fiscal Compact Treaty and the huge concerns about the EU fiscal rules being introduced at that time. Because of course there was an uncertainty as to whether we would need to access additional support measures from the new European bailout structure. So there's kind of a certain irony in observing the debate now, because I think that the dogma that characterised a lot of the discussion back then with regards to the type of rules that needed to be put in place, I think there's both a political and an economic practicality in the mindset that now exists with regards to fiscal policy, and that is absolutely to be welcomed. I think it's also important to say, though, that we perhaps see some of that dogma now in the monetary policy space, and of course that's imposing a massive fiscal cost on many governments across the European Union. But I suppose that's why we have the fiscal rules suspended, but of course that wasn't going to last forever. So I suppose just to look at what the Commission published last November, and to pick up on some of the points made in Robert and Rosa's paper, I suppose particularly when we look at what was published, and obviously it's a very detailed and technical set of proposals, but and I was struck up, Sebastian put up a phrase there, a Stability and Growth Pact Mark IV, and there is an element of almost I suppose a reassertion of the rudimentary debt and deficit rules that we're all only too familiar with, but to be now calculated over, I suppose, what looks like an election cycle or a political cycle between 4 and 5 years, and then of course the debt reduction, I suppose, trajectory then over that longer period of 10 years. And of course the other feature then is this expenditure benchmark, which again we're familiar with, but it doesn't have that 1/20th debt reduction rule by way of complement. So I suppose the key issue now for me really is the primacy, or probably one of the questions in my head is the primacy of the expenditure benchmark rule relative to that 10-year debt reduction path, and perhaps Sebastian or others may have those answers in this room, but certainly that for me is one of the key questions in terms of the success or otherwise of the fiscal rules, particularly in terms of the investment challenges that so many countries now have across the European Union. I think the other thing is there is a certain degree of innovation as well with regards to the compliance procedures, and certainly bringing a Minister for Finance before the European Parliament is certainly quite a novel idea. How well that would work, and indeed would it ever happen, of course, I think there's large question marks over that. But nonetheless, I think there's a willingness to try and, I suppose, introduce a greater degree of accountability into the fiscal framework that previously perhaps was not there. I suppose just in terms of picking up on two features of the paper, and the first relates to the appropriate debt metric. And again, I'm looking around the room, and I know there's a few people like myself over the years who've been making that argument that we should be looking at debt servicing payments as the more appropriate metric of observation, as opposed to the stock of debt. And I do take on board what Sebastian said about the variability of interest over a period of time. I do think though that looking at debt servicing on its own was never going to be sufficient. We also have to look at the debt maturity profile and of course the composition of debt. And I suppose what's really interesting at the moment is that we know that about I saw somewhere there's about 21% I think of debt when you average across the EU member states, about 21% has been taken on during related to pandemic-related expenditures alone. So obviously there's all sorts of questions there about, I suppose debt issuance and all that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I suppose the thing is, I think debt servicing plus looking at that debt maturity profile plus the composition of the ownership of the debt or the issuance of the debt, I think is certainly I think the paper has made an important contribution in that regard in terms of looking at the predictive features of that with regards to future crises. I think to a certain extent though the die has perhaps been cast by the Commission now when they launched their paper last November, and the stock of debt is going to remain the key metric. The second, I suppose, feature that I just wanted to pick up on the paper is the treatment of investment in the new fiscal rules. And I suppose, disappointingly, in the new expenditure benchmark, we don't have an explicit adjustment for investment, which, interestingly, I think, aside from the economics of the fiscal rules, politically, it's been a fascinating exercise over the last 2 years, and I must admit I don't follow these things as closely now as I used to in my previous life, but certainly in terms of just the degree to which member states themselves attempted to get organised in terms of influencing the outcome and shape of the fiscal rules, particularly think of Netherlands and Spain in their paper, and Italy then having a slightly not too distant, but different set of priorities. But I suppose the key issues, firstly, in terms of this new expenditure benchmark and the treatment of the failure to adjust for investment, which is a disappointment. But I think the second thing then is obviously this, debt reduction trajectory, and of course the allowance for growth enhancing measures and investment, and that comes back to the question about the primacy of the expenditure benchmark relative to how will both interact with each other effectively. So I suppose on a positive note though, like the benchmark, obviously there's a degree of forward looking in it, element to how it will be calculated, and that is to be welcomed. But I suppose that current and capital expenditure has not been divorced from the treatment of investment, I suppose, is disappointing. I suppose just the last thing I just wanted to say, or there's two final points. I was struck by what Barbara was talking about in terms of the other initiatives that are taking place at an EU level. And there's an element to me of that, this debate on the fiscal rules is really important, but we won't see the full potential or ideally, we need to see greater moves with regards to a fiscal union as well, particularly with regards to debt issuance, and with regards to that co-investment by the European Union. Now we're seeing, I think, beginning to see the start of that, of course, with Next Generation EU funding, but I think we need to see an awful lot more of that into the future to ultimately ensure that we have a fully functioning fiscal framework across the European Union. I suppose the last thing, of course, is that in any of these things we look at the impact in Ireland, and I suppose again there's an irony because Ireland finds itself now fully compliant with the fiscal rules as they're currently designed. We well exceed the structural budget deficit, the MTO, and I suppose even when we adjust for corporation tax revenues. So I suppose there's the question really is that when we have our public finances in an eye-wateringly healthy state, and that side by side with massive investment demands, the question is, will the fiscal rules, the new fiscal rules, really, have any sort of an impact or any sort of a greater impetus for us in terms of greater investment? And I think that the simple answer is no. And Sebastian's already covered that in some ways we need to have our own strong domestic framework, and of course there are political choices in how that is designed. But I think ultimately there's nothing inhibiting Ireland at the moment from allocating more to investment. And again, this comes back to political choices. So I suppose just to finish up and say, to congratulate Robert and Rosa on a very comprehensive, very detailed and excellent paper, and I think a very timely contribution to the debate. And I'm looking forward to hearing all your views as well, because no doubt there's a lot in the room, a lot of opinions in the room. Okay, Margaret.
Thank you very much.
We're going to do pointless questions because we have to.
We don't have much time.
No.
Okay. Sadly, we have very little time, so
Because the next panel.
yes, the next panel is coming up. I see 2 hands raised already. So, can you say who you are, please, before you make your remarks?
I was just suggesting to take 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yes, so Senator Osprey Higgins, I'm on the Finance Committee with Marie Sherlock. We made our own submission into the EU governance review. We raised a lot of the concerns that were here in terms of the arbitrary nature really of the 60% and the 3%, which are of course, I think the 3% kind of comes from the French Treasury in the 1980s. It's kind of a historic artifact rather than having any economic or scientific base. And we also spoke about the golden rule, which does seem to have been put aside as a proposal, and a number of the other measures. I just had kind of 2 questions and points around the debt and the other piece. One is, I think sometimes when we're talking about the debt, that the previous fiscal rules, and the idea that they weren't effective and they weren't complied with. But the key issue was, and Paolo Gentilini, the Commissioner, has acknowledged this, is that they were a mistake. They were damaging. So it's not solely a matter of, that they weren't effective and people didn't match up to them, but that they damaged us in terms of we had the EU 2020 vision of where we were meant to be as Europe in terms of smart, sustainable, inclusive growth, in terms of green transition, for example, and we effectively lost a decade across Europe on the very big challenges that we were facing and that we're facing that have intensified since in terms of things like climate change and social cohesion. So we lost ground, and I think that's, when we talk about it's not a matter of what's a more effective tool, it's a matter of how do we mitigate against the damage that was done by an excessive emphasis on the fiscal rules. For example, within the semester process, which hasn't got much mention here now, but where the fiscal rules ended up dominating over any of the other collective European policy targets that we have. And then within that piece on the debt, I suppose we're stuck with these arbitrary things because they're in the Maastricht Treaty of the 3% to 6%. So is the idea that we try to ensure that the DSA tool focuses on that debt sustainability rather than sustainable level of debt, but rather debt sustainability, which is things like the interest payments. And again, we look to the fact that Ireland, when we look to the last 3 years during the suspension of fiscal rules, has lost a window of 0% interest. So the fact is what we borrow next year is going to be more expensive than what we could have borrowed last year, which is extra public cost. So, it's an example of where the apparently prudent thing is costing us more, leaving aside things like construction costs going up and all of the rest, and inflation. But the other piece is in terms of investment, I'm still concerned, and some of the language, even from the EU Commission office, they spoke about debt sustainability as the Holy Grail, but then investment in growth. But what I'm concerned about, and I think actually Sebastian Barnes pointed to this, is a lot of the public investment we need will not be in growth. It is effectively, what they call in Scotland, preventative spending. So we are spending on the flood defences because of the potential cost of flooding. We're spending on social cohesion because the cost when that breaks down. And we're spending, in relation to the climate crisis because of the devastating cost. So it's cost avoided. And it's really hard to see in terms of the unobservables, talking about the unobservables of growth, but the unobservables, which gets talked about a lot, I know, in the fiscal rules, where are the unobservables in terms of the cost we have avoided by that public investment. And the very last thing, and I question this just on public investment, I'm really concerned at this idea of, the low debt countries, different scrutiny, because I think that was one of the mistakes of the past for Europe's actual cohesion as an entity, was this two-tier treatment, because we have the problem with public investment whereby a lot of countries can't do public investment because they were forced to privatise and open up things to the market. So even when public investment might be the most effective way to, and inexpensive way to deliver a necessary social or climate outcome, they are forced to do it through a private market mechanism, which is all these ancillary extra profits and costs, because it's regarded as a market product now. There's a reason why, there's lots of public spending in Germany and France. And it's very hard for countries. Ireland's a really good example, I think, in that, because other countries have a lot of debt and still, want to public. Ireland doesn't have a lot of debt, but still can't do direct public investment because of so much has been privatised. And it's so hard tackling that public investment, is that collective bond you mentioned a way, is the idea that should be attached solely to public investment, the climate bond that I think was mentioned by Mr. Sweeney. And should that also involve some of the suspension of state aid rules if it does have EU spending in it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there's anybody else has a question or comment. I'll take, I think, just one more, because I know that Sebastian Barnes is under pressure of time, so we're going to want to have a response from him first. So please.
I'll just be very brief. So just ask Rob, so let's say things like future liabilities like pensions, I wonder how you propose to account for those in fiscal rules.
Thank you. And I know, I'm sure everybody would love to get involved a lot more, but sadly we'll have to just keep this as a burning political issue. I'm bursting with questions myself about politics. The relationship between politics and the sort of technocratic rule-making at all levels, European and national, within this process. But there we go. It's a work in progress. I'm going to turn first to Sebastian to avail of his expertise before he's to go.
So sorry, I apologise. I'm going to walk out after my own answer, which is probably the ultimate form of protest. I just want to pick up what you were saying. In terms of expenditure, basically what they're taking is the same sort of operational target in terms of expenditure, but they're getting there in a different way. So the old way was derived from the structural balance. The new way is derived from this new frame, from this exercise I just showed you. So the old framework is out, it's scrapped, and that logic is in. And it's the same instrument, but it's going to be motivated in a different way. And a really subtle but important technicality is it's going to be set in terms of the level rather than the growth rate. Now you probably think, why does that matter? And the answer is that before they took the previous year's growth and then built on a certain amount. And that meant that basically if you spent too much one year, you'd be able to spend that the next year and then start from there. So it led to drift. Well, this new thing in terms of a levels rule, they've not really spelled this out, this is how they're thinking, will be big progress. Just to come back to the sort of investment point, I mean, it's a big subject, what happened in Europe over the last 15 years. But a lot of the problems were really in the years before, where you had Greece and Italy essentially ran two expansionary fiscal policies, and you had countries like Ireland and Spain that failed to manage macroeconomic imbalances. That led to the big downturn, which is what killed investment a lot. You can discuss afterwards what happened. I think there was clearly an ideological attachment by some people to some vision of austerity that was nonsensical. But also there were choices that were made, right? Countries could have prioritized investment, and they didn't. They did the easy thing politically, which is to increase wages and everything else that people like, and hope that people wouldn't notice that the capital stock was falling apart. So there is a question of political choice, and maybe that's where I want to end up for Ireland. I mean, for me, and actually this comes actually to the debt point as well. If you look a few years, if you look at the impact of higher interest rates on Irish debt service over the next couple of years, it doesn't really make any difference because the debt maturity is very long. There are some other reasons as well. But if you look 5-10 years ahead, it makes a huge difference. If we still have the levels of debt that we have today, the costs of these higher interest rates are going to be quite significant. Now, luckily, we have our debt on enough of a downward trajectory that probably by the time it kicks in, we'll have less debt. We won't be as sensitive to it. But these increases in debt that we've seen, the maturity only pushes the problem out. And if it weren't for the fact that debt were on a downward path, it would be much more of a problem. And I think where all of this ends up is that these rules are supposed to be a safety net, right? To stop other countries doing what Greece did, basically. But ultimately, if we want good policy, that's not a safety net problem. That's a question of social choice and discussion. And the truth is, in Ireland, I think, if you look over the past 25 years, it's been such a roller coaster ride that it's hard to know what normal times are. But on the whole, the country's growing very fast, and that means that choices are actually relatively easy in terms of the public finances because you've got more resources on average each year than you did before. But we're not probably going to be in that environment in the next couple of years. Growth will probably slow as the population ages, as the country is richer. And then the choices are going to become much, much harder. If you want more of this, you'll have to have less of that. And really whether we have the institutions to do that, particularly as we have like higher pension spending, things like that, is a very difficult question. And it's not really about the rules, but if you want good policy, it's ultimately about the quality of those decisions at national level. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and thank you very much for taking part. We need to wrap up quickly, so some closing remarks or any final thoughts from
Shall I just answer? I'll be very brief. Sorry.
No, go on.
Okay, sorry. Regarding Alice Mary Higgins's point, I was largely very much in agreement with what Alice Mary, Senator Higgins said. Privatisation hasn't been successful in Ireland. If you look at privatisation of Aircom, privatisation of Aer Lingus and so on, at least the recent experience with privatisation. I guess one thing I would add, and I guess some people might disagree with me, including on the left, is we do have an issue with how well we spend in Ireland. There's lots of large infrastructural projects that just go way over budget and they're very expensive to begin with. There's children's hospital, there's transportation budgets. Now, our planning system we do have advantages in terms of there's lots of public consultation, and in a sense it's quite democratic, but it also makes it expensive to build things, and that's going to be a challenge in terms of how we meet our climate goals. Regarding Rory's question about how I would account for pension liabilities, I mean, I'm not an expert on pensions by any means. Of course, you would have projections and actuarial projections, and obviously IFAC does some of this, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, about how much we're going to spend on pensions in the coming years. And I think an emphasis on the cost of servicing debt would subsume those concerns, because you would also look at, well, what are our projected costs of servicing debt within the next 5 to 10 years? And part of that would be future pension spending, future healthcare spending, and so on. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
No, I'm a much more mundane thing, but I have kids I'm supposed to collect at 4 o'clock, so I better run as well. I'm sorry. But no,
thank you very much indeed for taking part in this panel, and thanks again to Robin Rose for
Thank you very much, Niamh, and thank you, panel. And so all debates worth having are always constrained by time, and the worst situation we could be in is when we're hoping somebody will say something so that we can justify our existence. So thank you very much. I'm now going to ask David Nally, please, to be the moderator for the next session. David is the Director of Studies and Policy for FEPS, which is, as you know, the Federation of European Progressive Studies. He oversees economic and social policy portfolios and coordinates FEPS's scientific, quality and consultancy capacity. He teaches European economic governance at the University and the Institute for European Studies. And David has a PhD in economics. So David, I'll let you introduce your panel. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for your continued participation. Thank you.
Thanks to all the contributors and the participants. As mentioned, we have Nessa Harringen. Besides her work at the Parliament here, if I'm not wrong, you come from the constituency of Dublin
Central.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're also spokesperson on finance and health for the Irish Green Party. Next to her, Jonathan Halley, that works here at the European Commission representation in Ireland, where he's a European semester officer and has a long past at DG ECFIN, the enforcer, the creator enforcer of the fiscal rules. So the holder of the bar, in a sense. Next to him, Tom McDonald, the co-director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute of NERI, if I pronounce correctly. Thanks, Tom, for being here. First, I will go actually maybe to Jonathan with a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes, because you've heard a lot. Let's not go back to the what has been proposed, but what is your feeling from having worked at DG ECFIN first? Now you also have a more clear vision of country, member states viewpoint. Out of the building blocks of the new proposal of the Commission, if you want the net expenditure approach, the more slow and country-specific approach to debt reduction, where do you see the big novelty, and where do you see, if you want, the political difficulty of attaining a meaningful result at the European Council level that, by the way, will probably happen by the end of the month?
Thank you very much. But first of all, I should clarify. So yes, I am Jonathan Healy. I work at the European Commission representation here. I am the economics attaché. I have worked in DG ECFIN, but not on the fiscal rules. I should clarify that. I used to work as a desk officer on several different countries there.
Let me also do a disclaimer that whatever Jonathan is saying doesn't bind the European Commission, or it might not be the supervision, but we want the input of a political operator.
You heard Barbara Nolan, the head of representation here, gave a very good overview of the economic governance review, the timeline, what's happening. As has been mentioned already, at the core of the Commission's proposals is this idea of the net primary expenditure indicator. This has been chosen because it is something that is controllable. It is something that a Minister for Finance in all countries can decide on. Unlike in the past, we did have the other different concepts of the structural deficit and so on, which are good concepts but very difficult to determine. So really at the heart of the reforms is this new indicator that is based on expenditure. And this is all expenditure. It's primary expenditure because it excludes expenditure on interest payments, which are outside the scope of or outside the control of a government, and it's net. And I think this is a very important element. It's net because we don't tell member states how much they should be spending. It's up to a member state to decide. If a member state wants to increase expenditure, that's fine, they can do that. They just need to find the revenue to match, and that's where the net comes from. So overall, it's this net primary expenditure. On top of that, we're going to have these new 4-year plans, and this is to give a medium-term, well, it's the medium-term fiscal structural plan. And this is to give countries flexibility. So if there is a year where a country spends more than it should have, if it returns to the agreed path, it's not going to be an issue. It's going to be fine. However, if a country is consistently deviating from the agreed path, then there will be more of an issue. And this is where the greater enforcement mechanism will come into play. And I say greater, but yes, it hasn't really been enforced sanctions haven't been enforced over the past number of years. However, it's generally agreed that greater flexibility comes with greater enforcement. And this is where it will play a part. Another big element, I'll say, and this is, as Barbara mentioned before, at the beginning of COVID-19, the Commission started working on Next Generation EU, this €800 billion stimulus package for Europe to help us come out or recover from COVID. That has been adjusted given the war in Ukraine, and we have Repower EU as well being a part of that. And this has been, I would say, a complete game changer for the European Union. Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is the lion's share of that, is a game changer in that it's a performance-based instrument. So unlike in the past where member states would basically submit receipts for projects undertaken, now with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, member states must achieve what they set out to do. And this is achieved through milestones and targets. And it's only on the fully achieved milestones and targets will a country receive money. And this is a game changer. And those recovery and resilience plans are investments, and Ireland is going to receive, is set to receive about €1 billion in grants from Europe for its recovery and resilience plan. However, those plans include investments and reforms. And I would say for the first time, we have teeth behind the implementation of reforms that are linked to common EU objectives. In the case of the Recovery and Resilience Plan, the green and digital transitions are at the core of not just the plans, but this whole commission. And the reason why I bring up the reforms is in the proposed change to the fiscal rules, the medium-term plan will not just be a quantitative element, it will also involve the investments and reforms that a member state wishes to introduce over the medium term. And this is huge because, once again, we're linking reforms, which in most cases do not carry any cost, but the benefits can be huge. And those reforms will also play a part in the change to the fiscal rules. Just to go back to, I know it's been said just many times about the 3 and 60%, they're embedded in the treaty. That's not up for discussion at the moment, and the treaties will not change. So I accept that there's a lot of different opinions on that. And just to say that we have shared your report with the colleagues in Brussels, those people working on the review of the rules, they have been made aware. And it was also good to hear earlier that some people have also contributed to the online publication. Yeah, I think
Thanks a lot. And actually, I would like to follow up with Tom and Neza on the same topic on fiscal rules before going to the broader aspects of economic governance, because fiscal rule is one part of a broader picture. With a similar question, what makes you hopeful? So where you would like to see some results, some changes, And where do you think instead there is no appetite or political vision? To go?
Well, where am I hopeful, I guess, is a good place to start. So I suppose I am coming at it completely and unashamedly from a political point of view. And I suppose what makes me hopeful is that I do see this as a kind of a new era, or the possibility of a new era maybe. So to me, the fiscal rules, as constrained as they are, and obviously the big constraint here is that they are written into all the documentation, and that makes it very constrained. But that, you know, initially, the fiscal rules are, you know, they were set up as a way of creating, within the single market, cohesion through economic conformity, essentially, and that's very difficult for lots of nation states to deal with. And I think this new purpose, even the fact that I know, I was kind of like listening intently from the back there, Senator Alice Mary, because we talk about this quite often, about the opportunity now to have different discussions around not just the impact in the past of what the fiscal rules have done to particular countries, but how they could almost restructure economies into the future. And for people like me, and I know other politicians, the challenge of kind of reorientating some of our, you know, the kind of the big beasts of our economy, like the things like health services, things like just the kind of the status quo, the leviathans of how we consistently run things. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. And so I think what I see the hope here, or the ambition here, might be that we start to have those kind of conversations around how we, you know, change direction for some of those very, I feel like they're large vessels of how we run our economies. And if we can do that as a group, and that, you know, instead, and I think possibly the challenge for the EU will be to do that in a way that makes them a leader globally in terms of those big challenges like climate change, but also like we're seeing in all economies, like housing and like health services and like demographics. And that we become leaders, but not protectionist leaders, you know, that we actually build structures in that enable other economies to come along with us. I think, just to finish up then, I think the two areas that worry me the most is, I think I'm very clear, certainly, that the 3% and the 60% are locked in, and there's only so much we can do there. I would very much like to see it more as a kind of a more discursive didactics, you know, standards, not rules, that countries could move towards certain standards. I'm not sure that we will get there, but I think either or, my concern is around kind of governance and oversight and data, and if there'll be a serious commitment to that, because certainly, as much as we like to think the EU is very transparent, I don't always feel like that, sitting in budgetary oversight and trying to chair committees and trying to work out why, you know, even medium-term decisions were made isn't always very clear to me, and I do worry about that. The other part of it then is that move towards, I guess, net expenditure. I don't know if I mean, look, I have spent the last few months looking at, or in the Budgetary Oversight Committee, looking at our recent tax and Taxation and Welfare Commission report, and you know what we could do in this country. And we've had all sorts of, including some of the speakers today, people come into us, but also like a lot of stakeholders from Irish society. And the overarching point of that report was we need to broaden the tax base. And the level of resistance that we've seen to that on the ground from, you know, the big stakeholders in Irish society would really give you pause for thought. And I understand why that's the mechanism that we're looking at, and I kind of be supportive of it, but I wouldn't underestimate the political difficulty there. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the rules overall will have a very modest impact on Ireland in particular, but they are an improvement, certainly, I think, from a transparency point of view. They are simpler. Currently, the rules as they stand are extremely difficult to explain or to understand for anyone other than you know, somebody who spent months deep diving into the issue. That's a problem in terms of democracy, because if people don't understand the rules, how can they make informed decisions? And they can't, is the issue at the moment. So moving to a net primary expenditure Benchmark is simpler, it's easier to explain and makes more sense. Structural deficits, structural balances are hugely problematic again in terms of they're constantly being revised. Measures of output gaps are notoriously difficult to estimate. So that has led to a lot of policy mistakes and has arguably been pro-cyclical. So moving away from that is positive as well. In terms of have the changes gone far enough? Well, I would actually argue, I would agree with Sebastian's point about the rules themselves not necessarily being a barrier in terms of productive investment. However, the problem is the one that Nessa has just identified, which is that it's extremely difficult to increase taxes because there's always going to be a loser associated with that, and there will always be a lobby group that will fight extremely hard to prevent it from happening. And at the same time, current spending is more salient generally than capital spending. There is an interest group that will fight to get it expanded, and that does create a problem in terms of capital spending. But those are issues in terms of political economy at the domestic level, arguably. So there is a lack of maturity about the debate. So I would prefer to see, rather than net primary expenditure, it should be expenditure and revenue. We need greater clarity on that net point. The net point hides too much. There needs to be an understanding that expenditure increases versus tax increases. These things are interchangeable. Ultimately, a tax cut means less public spending somewhere else, and that to me is highly problematic. In terms of how it will play out, I'm very, very concerned about. I've heard the word negotiated and assessed and all of this too many times today. So that seems to me that the process will continue to be political and will essentially involve bargaining. I would much rather see independent and well-resourced fiscal councils at the national level, part funded by national governments, part funded by the European Commission, but independent of both, that in the same way as the OBR in the UK provide objective analysis of a fiscal pathway proposed by government, but also a pathway in terms of potential output over the next 5 or 10 years as well. That would help avoid situations like in Ireland at the moment, where at the drop of a hat, all of a sudden we're proposing tax breaks worth hundreds of millions potentially, which is insane to do it as quickly as that. And yet we're doing it, and yet we're seemingly going to do this anyway. So I think that kind of halfway house between the Commission and the national government would be very, very helpful. Again, that doesn't have an implication for spending or revenue per se. It's just about that sustainability pathway, and again keeps the analysis domestic and creates a body that can explain policies and outcomes in the same way that Trussonomics could be responded to by the OBR and the implications thereof. Then finally, I suppose in terms of two further points. The debt sustainability analysis is something that I agree with, conceptually at least. It speaks to the need to move towards multi-annual budgets. So rather than having a big bang surprise budget 2024, here we are, you have rolling 5-year budgets, which look at population profiles, which look at standstill costs, which look at the implications of different policy measures, and make these decisions following a long period of consultation, including with bodies such as the Budgetary Oversight Committee, but also academics coming in to talk about the cost of particular proposals. In terms then of space for climate investment in the fiscal framework, obviously climate investment in particular is problematic because the benefits of the climate investment are global, whereas the policies and the expenses are made domestically. And that means that there will be under-provision of climate infrastructure at a national level, in the same way that there's an under-provision of research and development at a corporate level, which justifies the case for state, or in this case superstate, intervention to counteract that structural under-investment. And that means that there is a very important role for central fiscal capacity to ensure that that under-investment doesn't happen. So contributions from the Central European Fund to part pay for climate investment absolutely makes sense to me. Not all necessarily through borrowing. I think there is scope for EU-wide taxation in terms of carbon tax, carbon border tax, levies on single-use plastics, levies on aviation fuel and so forth, to build up a central fiscal capacity. But also, so that kind of model, kind of a carrot approach to come along with the stick approach to incentivize positive behaviour rather than punishing negative behaviour would be a frame that I think would be more successful. And we've seen in terms of what countries did in the 1990s to attain convergence, but also in terms of their desire to get access to EU funds, have shown that a carrot approach, saying we will give you something if you do this, rather than we will punish you if you don't do this, is better in terms of the likely outcomes, and is likely to be more sustainable in terms of the whole project surviving out to the longer term.
This last point of yours, Tom, allows me for a little comment, because you're touching on the other side of the fiscal rule, the other part of the coin of the European economic governance. There is not the fiscal rules, the fiscal capacity.
Yeah.
So the proposal of the Commission was very much on revision of the fiscal rules, which is the European coordination of national fiscal stance. At the moment, there's nothing under discussion on the real, if you want, European public investment, European spending, which is very much in line with what you stressed of the necessity of coming up with a big, could be innovation, but certainly is a climate public investment or public-led investment agenda, particularly for all the regions that need to transition. We have done some work with the TASC also for the relevance of rural areas or areas who work with intense brown economy that needs sufficient funds to transition, and the market will not always be able to provide that. So at the moment, it's true. We mentioned the Next Generation EU. It's a good novelty. Plenty of other novelties have been carried out in the last, after the financial and the Eurozone crisis, but nothing has entered into the real official European economic governance rule. Next Generation EU will phase out in 2026. The European Stability Mechanism created much below is still intergovernmental. Other funds done by the EIB have been are also particularly not community law. Where do we go in this direction of creating room for real European public goods? Now could be defense, could be security, climate, for sure. So this is what's the future of the Next Generation EU after 2026 of the European spending, the European budget? Do you feel here in Ireland the need of having a support from the European budget on certain energy security, energy supply, for instance, or transition? Where and what do you think is the argument that can be used, maybe with other member states, to arrive there? And connected to this, where do you see actually the difficulty from Ireland to accept a bigger role? What would you think you would need to ask to maybe southern member states in order to allow for a bigger European spending in a sort of this approach?
I don't know who wants to start. I'll answer again from just a political point of view. I mean, look, I think that it's worth saying at the beginning, I think Irish people are hugely in favour of the EU and absolutely buy in to the EU. I do think into the future there's, there'll be a discussion that the EU has to have around how we build trust and how we hold on to social cohesion and how we continue to sell people on the idea of the EU as a shared community. And I think one of the problems for Ireland there is that there are some areas like energy, for example, where there's a natural interconnectedness and it makes sense and people can understand that this is, you know, into the future this will be a grid that we sell and we buy, and it all makes sense if we work together, and when it's raining one place and it's blowing wind and all, you know, that'll all make sense. I think there are other areas where people in Ireland may be more concerned around a shared budget that they have less governance and say over, and I would put defence in that area, and certainly I would share that that concern. I think that, you know, we've had a discussion in the EU, and I know it's doing the rounds around how you make the big decisions, and you know how you treat a veto, and how those decisions are made. And I think, you know, you have countries within the EU who take a completely different view of what their role in kind of geopolitics is, and until you nail down some of those kind of issues, I'm not sure you're going to see a huge buy-in to a kind of a larger shared budget, even though we're one of those countries who has really done quite well at it.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland can do all of these things using its own resources at the moment, so it's not necessarily that Ireland would be pushing forward looking for additional resources necessarily. Ireland would most likely be a contributor to any such fund. I suppose the EU needs to achieve, or ought to achieve, its net zero targets out to 2050. Part of that is a just transition that's required for workers in different countries. And the issues are different in every country. But I would say, look, ideally a quid pro quo to moving forward with reformed EU fiscal rules, even though they are superior to the current system, ought be a movement towards at least some modest EU central fiscal capacity, which could be increased over time. It doesn't even have to involve borrowing at the start. It could be taxes done at a European level, which are only appropriate at European level. Ireland couldn't really introduce a tax on aviation fuel, but the EU could. Similarly, you could have a border tax for carbon. So there are mechanisms that can be used. Also, the main contributors to that would be the higher income economies. So it would be progressive. It would reinforce the EU fiscal rules by creating a carrot which is likely to improve compliance with the rules. So there is an advantage there. You gain access to these funds if you comply with the rules over a 5 or 10 year period, and therefore there's a rationale to do it. But at the same time, all countries are incentivized to really push on the net zero green transition. That it's a public good. All countries are combined trying to get to zero. So we need to help the weaker countries, which have less fiscal capacity, to achieve those goals. So I suppose that is the kind of frame that I would try and give it. Other areas, green R&D is another one, but there are other examples. So obviously we had the COVID crisis, but having some counter-cyclical capacity automatically built in is surely desirable. There will be heterogeneous shocks. There could be a natural disaster. A particular sector could collapse, which is very strong in a particular country. IT would be an example in Ireland. I doubt that's not going to happen, but even so, every country has its own vulnerabilities. So having that in place is surely a good thing. Other things like the vaccination program would have been another one, best paid for at a central level. Defence is a much more controversial area. I don't think you would get any kind of universal support in terms of defence, but I think in terms of green transition and perhaps even digital transition, those arguments are there. And overall, that central fiscal capacity could be beneficial in terms of greater compliance with the rules, which of course is a goal of the EU Commission as well.
Let me open up to your questions, but before I try my luck, Mr. Haley, one word from the Commission on the future of the next generation EU or future of fiscal capacity.
Well, I suppose when we talk about fiscal capacity, the question naturally becomes what for? Is it for defence? Is it for climate? But for common EU objectives, the EU has already stepped up. We've seen that with COVID, with Next Generation EU. We've seen it at the very beginning with the SURE programme, which was the short-time working scheme. The EU stepped up. We have now the new EU energy platform. So when there is a common objective there, the EU will step up. But the question is, what for? We have the Innovation Fund, which is going to be 40 billion towards climate initiatives. We have Repower EU, which is 270 billion. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has said that the Commission will come up with a proposal before the summer on a sovereignty fund, which this is to try and help businesses in Europe reach their net carbon neutrality goals. So I think the Commission, when there is a need, the Commission can step up to the mark and look into it. With Next Generation EU, it is a once-off instrument. It's here until 2026. It's been a very successful instrument so far. It has already dispersed over 150 billion to member states. We've received commitments of 250 billion for expenditure on climate objectives, over 150 billion or close to 150 billion, I think, on digital objectives. So overall, the Next Generation EU has been thus far a success, but it is time limited.
Success, but time limited. Questions, comments, or curiosities? Please, introduce yourself.
Daniel Higgins, SIP2, and I'm an economic researcher with SIP2. So I'll start with it from an academic. I have a question for the Commission representative, but I'll start with 20 years ago when I was learning economics. I was told that investment can crowd out the private sector. It can max out the economy and lead to inflation. So that's the blackboard. But since that time, there's been new ideas. One topical idea 20 years ago was endogenous money. And that was, endogenous money is rather, well, you can provide as much money to the economy as you want. It still has to have a use. There still needs to be a demand. Now, endogenous money was a European idea, mainly arising from sticky prices. You know, prices can't just change overnight, you know, and especially in the labour market, you can't just change wages overnight. So, if you look at the Irish case, coming round to the question now, during full employment back during the Celtic Tiger and before, we had sticky prices thanks to social partnership. And I know since then there's been a huge changes. There's been ground shifts in the engine room of the Commission, you know. And in terms of what for, do the Commission, do you see, I know trade unions vary greatly across member states in terms of interests and where they're at. But, you know, surely trade unions can play a positive role in terms of reform plans. Is that true? I'm not well versed in, as you guys, you know.
Other inputs? Otherwise, we go probably to John, but also Tom, you want to perhaps first?
Well, just to say that for the fiscal rules, and it is the case for nearly every other EU initiative, there will be public consultations. There is engagement with trade unions, stakeholders, the social partners, member states, civil society. That's embedded in everything that we do. I know for Next Generation EU, it was one of the core principles, and it was one of the conditions for getting a plan agreed by the Commission. And I know here in Ireland, the Irish government was, I can say, maybe a little bit criticised in that there was only a 3-week consultation period provided for the Irish Recovery and Resilience Plan, which we found wasn't sufficient it wasn't long enough. It didn't give all stakeholders time because basically it was put up on a website and a few weeks later it was gone. But the Commission constantly brings up the importance when it's dealing with member states that they engage with the stakeholders and that they take on board their opinions. And I should say as well, like here in my role here at the Commission representation, my role is also to ensure that the colleagues working on Ireland in Brussels are aware of what's going on here in Ireland. And for that, myself and my colleagues at the representation are feeding them the reports and our interactions with stakeholders back to the colleagues in Brussels. So even this report has been sent to the colleagues so that they're aware of those views.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. I think we have come to an end. I have to thank indeed Rosa and Rob for the great contribution. All those that contributed today to the panel and to the discussion. Big thanks on the side of FEPS to TASC and to all of you. I invite you back. I invite you back on stage, remembering also the important motto. I would say it's the name of TASC, but I think that what we also would like at FEPS and to keep remaining engaging on policy action on social change. It takes quite some time to change it at the national level. It takes even more to change it at the European level, but it is also by engaging cross-country. Very happy to join you here and to have Commission representatives, members of different parties. It's only by contributing with cross-cutting collaboration that we can bring meaningful change. Please.
Thank you. So now it's my great, of course, it's my great pleasure to send you home. That might sound not the wrong thing, but it's my great pleasure to get the last word, at least the last word from this platform, although people are welcome to have a discussion informally afterwards if you like. But I do want to do the most important thing, which is to thank the people who made the event possible and who made, if you forgive me for making your opinion on it, made the event a success. So firstly, I want to thank Rob and Rosa for the research and the work that went into producing the document, which was the foundation document for our discussion here today, and without which we wouldn't have had this discussion, and I think it contributes massively to our understanding and the debate. I want to thank all of our panelists, both the most recent panel and the earlier panel, for their contributions, which I thought were very broad-ranging and apposite and interesting. And of course, I want to thank Niamh and David for chairing and for getting the most out of each of the panels on your behalf. I want to thank you, all of you, for your attendance and for your participation and for your ongoing support for TASC. And if you don't mind, and this might sound a bit kind of selfish or narcissistic, so I want to thank TASC. And I want to thank TASC firstly for being there. Been there for 22 years, by the way, heading towards our 23rd year. For being independent, and therefore, because we're independent, having the capacity to host discussions and debates such as this, which is the lifeblood of what we do. And for keeping that space alive, I want to thank you, our supporters, for the help that you give us in relation to that. As you probably know, TASC is happy to receive funding from time to time to specific research objects and so on, research projects, provided that they're consistent with our values. But to keep the spirit of TASC and the way that the people who set it up in the first place, it's important that we do our own research and we chart our own course as to what are the issues, which, as David said, is all about action for social change. It's not about social analysis, it's about social change. And so I just want to remind you of that and to let you know that if you're in a position to assist us in any way, either by your effort, by being a speaker, by participating and so on, or if you want to help us in any other way, please do keep in contact with us. And I think the access to us is very, very visible through our website and otherwise. But as I say, thank you again for attending. I think it was a very, very useful debate, and safe home. Good evening.